Alright, my name is Grace Edelman, and this is my presentation on classical music and the orchestra. So this will be a discussion of past and present social, political, and economic impacts of classical music and the orchestra. I chose this topic because I have felt connected to music in general and have played instruments such as the piano and violin for years, since I was 7. And it's always been a big dream of mine to be part of an orchestra. I haven't got to be part of one yet, and maybe not as a career, but definitely as a hobby. So the social, political, and economic impacts of classical music have significantly evolved with the genre over the past century. Firstly, the social impacts. So the social impacts of classical music and the orchestra are very different today than they once were. It's a popular philosophical belief that in order to understand the values of a society or culture, one must understand the popular music and art of the time. During the 1800s, the orchestra was the most popular genre of music, and it was considered one of the most prestigious and desirable social events to attend on any given night. And nowadays, although attending orchestra performances isn't necessarily the most popular social event to attend, especially in modern Western culture. One way that classical music shows itself is through movie soundtracks. Examples such as Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, the classical music score that was composed for these movies are almost as iconic as the movies themselves. So that's one of the main ways that classical music presents itself in our society today. Some of the ways that classical music has impacted politics in the US and Europe. So firstly, Beethoven was very passionate about politics, and he did let this seep into his music on multiple occasions, and this really actually helped to create his complex greatness. He took liberties and he took risks that hadn't necessarily been taken before in music, and these risks that he took led to the era of classical music known as Expressionism, where personal expression was very encouraged. And a more recent example of classical music and politics would actually be through the removal of the saxophone from the list of main orchestra instruments in respect of African American culture. Other than this, there's not much integration between classical music and politics that I've found. Lastly, the economic impacts of the orchestra in its kind of golden era in the 1800s compared to today. So obviously the orchestra used to be a top player in the US economy when it was in its most popular state, but unfortunately that's not the case anymore, and many orchestras, especially orchestras in smaller communities and smaller towns, struggle each season to keep afloat. Although the orchestra will probably never return to its former glory, we shouldn't necessarily be mourning its loss just yet. Many believe that with a few adjustments to form factors, such as changing up different parts of the performance, or changing seating arrangements, etc., it could see a growth in popularity. And thankfully, it's seen changes like this in the past and come out better for it, such as it's changed from the Baroque era to the Romantic era, specifically. I couldn't really be talking about this topic without bringing up COVID-19 and the global pandemic's effect on the industry. It's hit the industry pretty hard, and almost every concert house in the US has effectively shut down their 2020 through 2021 season and their 2021 through 2022 season. And it's left musicians without income and pretty bleak futures ahead. There's not much that is known on how the industry will be impacted long term because of COVID, but honestly, it's not looking very good. To wrap up, The orchestra is no longer experiencing wild success like it once was, and it also holds much less influence than it once did in Western society, politics, and economics. And this has been my presentation on classical music and the orchestra. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for listening.